Good morning, good evening, or whatever time of day it is you're watching this. My name's Zachary Bashore, presenting severe wildfire impacts on local Missoula businesses. Today I'm going to run you through the costs of megafire on the Missoula community. Throughout this presentation, I'll break down Missoula's community and economy, the impacts of wildfire have had on them, a brief wildfire and forest ecology lesson, human impacts on wildfire, the effects of these human impacts, and methods to reduce these impacts with cost benefits. But before we get started, I'll tell you a little bit about me. I'm the owner of Bashore Land Management, a consulting forestry company based out of Missoula. That's my business partner, Bambi. I studied forestry at the University of Montana, and while I was in school, I was a wildland firefighter for the Forest Service out of Phillipsburg. I serve on the board of directors for the Missoula Area Chamber of Commerce, and I'm also the chairman for the Forest Resources Committee of the Missoula Chamber. Most recently, I'm a member of Class 4 of Resource Education and Agricultural Leadership Montana through MSU Extension. As we all know, Missoula relies on natural resources to sustain a vibrant economy. There are approximately 4,400 businesses in Missoula County that represent a very diverse array of industry. The state of Montana sees 12.5 million visitors annually. Those visitors spend $300 million in Missoula County every year. 50% of that spending is done in restaurants, bars, and gas stations, 25% in hospitality and retail, and the other 25% in miscellaneous local businesses. And this creates 4,500 jobs. So what impacts does wildfire have on this? In 2017, our most recent detrimental fire season, 56% of businesses saw a decrease in customer volume, while 25% had to postpone or cancel trips and events. The state of Montana lost $240.5 million in visitor spending, and that was down 6.8% from the year prior. Missoula County lost $20.4 million in visitor spending, and that translates to $81.60 per every acre that was burned. This means that every Missoula County business lost $4,600. And for businesses like my own that didn't see a loss that heavy, you can figure other businesses carried that burden 10 times over. In 2017, in the state of Montana, we spent $393 million fighting fire. Missoula County burned 250,000 acres, and two fires burned 86% of those acres and cost $96 million in total. This averaged out to $450 an acre in firefighting. Putting that tax burden on Missoula residents would cost each resident $800. There's a significant loss of resource in severe wildfire. 38% of what burned in the Rice Ridge fire was in the Lolo National Forest plan for timber harvesting. After the fire, only 3,500 acres were salvaged. This produced 26 million board feet, an average 7,400 board feet an acre. In today's market, that brought in $10 million to the local economy. If the 60,000 acres that were planned for harvesting had survived, there would have been approximately $177 million in resource going back to the local economy. That means we lost $167 million in planned resources. That translates to a loss of $1,045 per every acre burned in that fire, whether it was resource abundant or not. Severe wildfire also affects our health. A recent study from the University of Montana monitored tests done on Seeley Lake residents during the Rice Ridge fire and 11 months after, and found that every single person tested had a significant drop in their lung function. The main irritant in wildfire smoke is fine particulate matter, which reduces lung function, aggravates asthma, and worst case scenarios can cause stroke, heart attacks, or even death. In 2017, Missoula was the 11th most polluted city in the U.S. in annual particle pollution, and the 5th most polluted for short-term air quality. And we don't even use wood stoves in the valley. So to combat this, we use HEPA filters. The average HEPA filter costs $175 and filters 360 square feet. To filter 40% of the average home in Missoula, you'd need 3 filters, and each filter requires an internal replacement every year. These replacements cost $50 each, which comes out to $150 a year in replacements. If all 47,000 households in Missoula did this, it would cost $24.7 million, or $675 a household. But fire is a natural thing, it's a natural process, and we're always going to have to live with it. But there are many factors that make the wildfires we see today not as natural as one may think. Let's take a step back in time, Before we inhabited this great state of Montana, forest and wildfire had a symbiotic relationship. Fires would burn into past fire scars and put themselves out. They also would burn in the same area every 25 to 150 years depending on location and certain ecological factors. What this meant is that there were many more fires, but they weren't nearly as large. This naturally made forests look like a checkerboard, or what I would call a mosaic of stands of different ages based on when the last fire burned through that forest and how intense it did. Our forests have adapted to fire over the millennia. The Missoula County landmass is 1.7 million acres, and the vegetation types I'll show you today make up 40% of that landmass, which is approximately 680,000 acres. In lower elevation forests, fires were quite a bit more frequent, not generally as intense. Our state tree, the sun-loving ponderosa pine, has thick insulative bark that protects its cambium layer from being penetrated by fire. Now, the cambium layer is what allows water and nutrients to flow up and down the tree, so if it's penetrated, the tree dies. Now, bear in mind, these forests are the majority of where all of us live. The ponderosa pine also drops its lower limbs, which discourages fire from climbing up into the crown of the tree. Growing in succession to the ponderosa pine is the shade-loving Douglas fir. Douglas fir have thinner bark and shorter needles, and they're quite a bit more fire-prone. However, with fire burning through these forests every 25 to 50 years, it didn't leave the fir with a long enough lifespan to grow up and compete with the pine, whereas the fire-loving pine continued to thrive. In higher elevations, lodgepole pine dominates the landscape. These trees are extremely fire prone. They have thin potato chip-like bark and shorter needles. They also have shallow root systems, so they grow closer to each other so wind doesn't blow them over. Growing underneath and intermittently with lodgepole pine is subalpine fir, which is a similar dynamic to how ponderosa pine and Douglas fir live together. They're also shade-tolerant species. They have very thin bark and short needles. So when fire would burn through these forests, it'd burn rather intensely, and they'd kill the majority of all the trees. But the lodgepole had adapted to this. They have closed cones, or what's called serotinous cones, that open with exposure to extreme heat, which allows new lodgepole seedlings to grow around the skeletons of their parents. So fire that would happen in these forests was called stand replacing fire, and historically it would occur in higher elevations every 75 to 150 years, which is actually a shorter interval than what we're seeing today. And then we came into the picture. The fires in 1910 claimed 87 lives and burned an area the size of Connecticut, which was nearly 3 million acres from eastern Washington to western Montana. A phenomenon like this happens once every 1,000 or more years. In response to public outcry to wildfire, and with little available knowledge of it, the Forest Service adopted what was called the 10 a.m. fire policy. This stated that every fire reported had to be put out by 10 a.m. the following day. This policy persisted for 43 years till 1978. So the usual couple 100-acre fire was put out at 10 acres or less. This allowed for fuel to continually build up and altered the mosaic or checkerboard of forests as we knew it. Coupling policies with further westward expansion and little available science of forest or wildfire, we built railroads in the middle which made unnatural fuel breaks, and we cut many of these old fire-adapted species and used them for building. And this allowed for the shade-loving, fire-prone trees to take over, which choked out the sun-loving, fire-adapted species and grew in much, much thicker. With less space between the trees, it allows insects and pathogens to spread easier. This adds more dead and dry fuel to the forest. A recent statistic actually shows that there are 35% more trees in the state of Montana than ever recorded before. And that's not a good thing. Combining this with climate change, we're seeing hotter, drier, and longer summers that are stressing trees of water and making them more susceptible to insects that are now regenerating an extra cycle every year due to milder winters. Resulting in much larger, much higher intensity fires. And what's worse is we've built houses and put values in between these areas, which does nothing but add to the complexity of being able to manage the fire. And these fires are burning upwards of 2,500 degrees. We've burned as many acres in the last 6 years in Montana than we did in the previous 10. In 2017, 0.01% of all fires in Montana burned 35% of all the burned acres. That's 3 fires. In 2015, 0.02% of fires in the U.S. burned 30% of all the burned acres. 15 out of 68,000 fires. Looking back at historical data, we're burning the same amount of acres today than we ever have, but with half the number of fires. And their impacts felt not just economically, but also ecologically. Fires are burning intense enough now that they're sterilizing the ground, which allows for little vegetation to grow back, makes soils hydrophobic, which causes landslides and erosion, and flows into our water supplies. They also leave a plethora of standing dead trees, which are a safety hazard to firefighters and recreators, and a loss of resource. And the worst part, it depletes the carbon that our forests hold, releasing it back into the atmosphere and furthering climate change. This is an example of erosion after some fires in the Bitterroot Valley in 2000. And it leaves us with headlines in the newspaper that look like this. A recent finding in the Animas River in Durango, Colorado, was that 80% of the fish in the river died due to contaminants a year after the 416 fire. So in short, it hurts our health, our ecosystems, and our economy. So how can we fix this? Restoration methods offer the most feasible way of doing so. It's important to recognize, though, that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to all forests, so it's important to find the right size. Every chunk of forest has different needs. We have to start by identifying areas of high value, high risk, and high impact to the community. And then we have to figure out what's most feasible to be done in these areas for the betterment of them. We can thin forests manually and mechanically, taking out the trees that fire would have taken out long before we got here, and allowing for new growth of desired species. We can put fire back on the landscape, but in a more controlled setting. Removing ground and ladder fuels, promoting species that need disturbance to regenerate in doing so, and conservatively emitting 5 times less the amounts of fine particulates in the smoke than if that same area were to burn this summer. So we can actually lower carbon emissions with more fire at the right time, or as I like to put it, replacing bad fires with good fires. Replanting vegetation back in nutrient-deprived areas, which improves soil stability for less erosion and reintroduces favorable species while doing so. And by using a non-traditional definition of preservation. We need to preserve the land we have and yet still manage it with sustainable community objectives. And carefully plan where and how we develop in rural and forested areas. And this has to be done on an extremely large scale. 30 to 40% of our forests need to be managed or altered. There are 14 million forested acres in Montana with visual signs of insects or disease disturbance. And lastly, we must weigh the benefits of the work. It has to be ecologically justifiable, operationally possible, and economically feasible. So in total, a severe wildfire costs the Missoula community $1,576.60 per acre burned in very easily quantifiable costs. And there are many costs we can't put a value on, with firefighter and public safety, devastated landscapes, and air and water quality. And coming from a contractor that oversees this type of work, $1,500 an acre would both thin and burn many of the acres in our forests. And for less than that, other methods of restoration can be done. And this is only counting acres with non-merchantable materials. Being able to salvage merchantable materials will not only stimulate the economy, but will give monetary returns that can go back to treating more acres. And there are priceless ecological benefits to restoration. It promotes species resistance, increases forest resiliency, enables ecosystems to respond, and realigns highly altered ecosystems. It's very simple. I created this on a giant Post-it note one night when I couldn't sleep, and it sat on my wall for a very long time, until finally it helped me to create this whole concept and presentation. So in conclusion, solely the quantifiable costs of severe wildfire are more than most restoration efforts. We can't put a value on what the costs have been to public health, water and air quality, and public and firefighter safety. Restoration has far greater ecological benefits. Businesses will continue to lose revenue in megafire events, and we will continue to have megafire events until this is done on a mass scale. Businesses will benefit from restoration by retaining air and water quality, continued visitor spending, improved recreational opportunities with fewer safety hazards and wildlife-favored prescriptions, and resources and product that favor jobs and economic growth. Here's my contact information and a link to this presentation. Please bring any questions, comments, or concerns you have to me. And here are some helpful resources that I used to create this presentation, and they'd be good to read. Thank you very much for listening, and let's keep our forests healthy.